Hey y'all, thanks as always for dropping in to check out another section of The Strongest Earth in the Multiverse. As always, it means a ton. And as always, this is taking place in a wider, interconnected Earth OCU universe. This section of the universe dealing mainly with Spider-Man and Arcane, aka the League of Legends series. But because there's so much of this universe, you'll of course be seeing other aspects of, say, Marvel or DC or something in between in this story, as you'll probably be seeing very soon. The only other thing that I'm going to drop here in regards to the story before the video starts is that because I'm mainly taking the characters from Arcane rather than most of the world, because the world here is mostly built on the foundation of Marvel, DC, and Dragon Ball, I'm going to be connecting some Arcane characters with some Marvel characters and DC characters, because I personally feel that that would make the story a lot more interesting, and it will allow me more places to go, specifically in this world. That's not to say there won't be some aspects of the Arcane universe, but for example, I'm connecting Powder and Vi to the Hardy family. They are the sisters in this universe of Felicia Hardy, aka Black Cat. And Echo, for example, was actually adopted by Otto Octavius instead of his original adopted father. Why did I make these choices? Well, you'll just have to see. It's really cool as always to have you guys around for the ride, and I'm your captain, and it's a pleasure to take you on another tour of the strongest Earth in the multiverse. Stay tuned, y'all. We're standing here on the precipice of a truly great moment, folks. In just 3 minutes, Dr. Reed Richards and his team of 3 others, including Dr. Susan Storm, Engineer Ben Grimm, and Civilian Envoy Johnny Storm, will be attempting the first interdimensional jump. If they succeed, it will be the greatest leap forward in transport technology since Bulma Briefs and Tony Stark cracked interstellar transport. Any words for the people at home, Dr. Richards? Only a few. I look forward to seeing Mr. Stark and Dr. Briefs when I come back, and finally showing something that even they haven't seen before. Reed Richards' voice crackled through Peter Parker's half-broken speakers as he sat enraptured on the bus, staring at his phone. The machine the scientific team sat in looked almost like a spear, the camera in the cockpit showing that that was designed very much like a rocket's. Made him think back to the moon landing. "Neil Armstrong, eat your heart out," Peter whispered, a grin on his face, before the phone was pulled away from him by a blue-haired girl. "Hey, Earth to Parker, are you gonna look up from your phone for a second? We're almost there," she said, snatching the phone back from Peter. "I will, honest." Peter took his phone back, almost immediately looking back at it. The girl, Powder, his best friend since he'd left middle school, rolled her eyes. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event, pal. I wasn't even born during first contact with aliens. I was more interested in trick-or-treating or something when interstellar flight was figured out." I get it. Powder pushed herself next to him, watching the screen with only half the intensity that Peter put out naturally. "Though when you lay out history like that, it doesn't seem that once in a lifetime," she whispered, Peter shushing her as the bus came to a stop, people filing out. "Peter's still watching that thing? Hasn't it been like an hour?" Echo Octavius said, stopping beside the two of them as the bus deboarded. Peter must have looked up at Echo for a second, maybe 2, but when he looked back down, "We're being told that the live footage from this historic event is being cut off. Some kind of electronic interference is pushing through, lightly from the static of the incredible launch, but we'll have..." Wait, sorry folks, I'm being told that S.H.I.E.L.D. is entering the scene, and it looks like we'll have to end the broadcast here. We'll be back on as soon as possible, the newscaster said, his blank, confused face only slightly more prominent than the severe disappointment that now washed over Peter Parker. "Jeez, sorry man." Powder patted his shoulder. "What the heck happened?" Peter scratched his head furiously. "Well, they said S.H.I.E.L.D., right? It could be anything. Maybe something went wrong with the launch," Echo muttered, before looking at the depressed look on Peter's face and correcting himself. "They probably just found something important out there that they don't want us normies to see," he elbowed Peter. "Relax, it's probably nothing. Spending the whole trip on the bus isn't gonna help those guys, right?" Yeah, I guess not," Peter sighed. "That's the spirit, Pete," Powder nudged the boy. "Let's go stumble our way through some natural history, huh?" "You still think we're going to the History Museum?" Peter asked, both Echo and Powder looking at him with confusion plastered on their faces. "Geez, I go through all the trouble of getting the class something cooler and nobody even checks the reminders." From the back seat of the bus, Harry Osborn leaned in, joining in the group of 4. "Look outside," he said with a grin on his face. Echo and Powder did just that to see a building with a giant O logo on top of it. Oscorp? Powder said, looking at Echo, who had the same look of half panic on his face. Exactly, and all of you nerds owe me. I had to ask my dad a lot of favors to get him to show us around. It's a once-in-a-lifetime deal, Harry said, walking out of the bus, waving at the others to follow him. Peter did, getting up to follow almost immediately after. Oscorp, Peter muttered, the same look of wonder on his face that he wore when he was dreaming of the spaceflight. Whoa, what a day, he said, almost dreamily. Meanwhile, his two other friends stood in the back, sweating just the slightest bit heavier. Oscorp, Powder sighed. What a day. She started scratching her arm as though she had just been swarmed by fleas. Relax, pal. Everything's fine. Echo placed a hand on the girl's shoulder as she looked up to him. You guys got in and out. Vi said nothing happened. Powder nodded numbly as she walked off the bus. Vi lied for her. She was thankful for that. But things most definitely didn't go well, as her other sister had been very keen to tell her. The whole thing was kind of a blur to her, even still. Her sisters had been contacted by the New York branch of the Thieves Guild for a job, their first ever job since their father had disappeared. They were on their own these days, having to pay for a household full of 3 minors. Food, drink, water, bath, electric, keeping up their father's old job, his old title, was just about the only way they were going to survive. Add on to that any other source of income they got was from Otto these days, Echo's father, who was barely staying afloat himself with the lack of work he was getting from Norman, and things weren't looking particularly great. Her sisters, Echo, they were taking care of him. Heck, even Peter was throwing in a few bucks here and there from every odd job he got. But Powder didn't want to be taken care of forever. You aren't ready for this, pal. Felicia said to her, maybe 100 times before last night. And every time Powder would swear up and down that she was, that there was no way that she would back down. And she was so sure she was right when they went into that place. Breaking into Oscorp was actually easy. Finding the so-called Oz formula was easier. Well, for Powder. She was the one of her siblings who found the papers that listed out the chemical components, and she was about the only one of her sisters who understood them. Meaning that she was the only one who knew where to be looking. She had already proven her worth. She really wished she had just stopped there, but she didn't. Of course she didn't. She had to try and take the thing out of storage, to beat everybody to the punch, and that worked about as well as she should have expected. Red lights blared overhead, as ear-piercing sirens blasted into her ears. What did you do? Felicia grabbed Powder by the shoulders. Vi was already barricading the door, the same one they had entered in the lab through. I just grabbed, without checking security? Good frickin'... Hey! We can fight when we make sure we don't spend the night in jail, Vi shouted, glancing back at the two of them, with a harshness that sent a shiver through both of their spines. It was a weird feeling to be thankful for being afraid, since Powder was 100% sure that the same feeling going through Felicia was one of the few things keeping her from throttling her. Barely having enough space to breathe now gave Powder a little bit of room to think, if just barely. Room enough to come up with an idea that she was now coming to regret. She saw a power source connected to something. What it was, she had no idea. She barely glanced at the schematics of the thing before that point when she was looking for the Oz formula, but she could tell it was powerful. So she grabbed the thing. It was smaller than she expected, much lighter, which made the thing that much easier to chuck like a baseball against the wall. There was a major flash of light in response. The machinery within the area was dashed to hell. Living test subjects, rats, snakes, spiders scurried out of their now smashed open cages as sparks of electricity that came off the now exploded power source mingled with just about every machine in its radius, causing them to spark with a strange blue aura that jumped from machine to machine almost like it was alive. The plus side of the mess she made was now there was a hole in the wall. Not a big one, but one just barely big enough for them to squeeze through. Apparently, Oscorp was incredibly well built for a simple science lab, but it was enough. Felicia set up a grapple point to a building nearby, the three of them pushing themselves out of the somehow successfully botched job one by one, until they were finally a safe distance away. Felicia didn't talk to Powder the rest of the night, but she heard her muttering to herself in her room. I knew it. I knew she wasn't ready. Job of the century, and she almost fucking jinxes the whole thing. Powder snapped back to the present, barely noticing that her friends had dragged her off the bus and into the lobby of the second most impressive science hub in New York. The first, obviously, being Stark Tower. Though, walking through the building, seeing the spotless marbled floors dotted with potential technological advancements straight out of sci-fi, even with Earth being what it was lately, did bump up the ranking in her mind. Everything had only gone down last night, but if there were any updated security measures or meetings that the staff had about the break-in, the staff didn't seem to mention it. In fact, they were perfectly cheery, accommodating, best guys you could ask for. Something Peter greatly appreciated as he read it all question after question for each piece of tech he walked past. A rudimentary cold fusion device meant to eventually compete with arc reactors, a satellite system meant to see incoming extraterrestrial objects, something that had become increasingly necessary lately with the vast amount of extraterrestrial encounters humanity had had over the years. Peter was basically in heaven going over it all. And watching Peter geek out over the whole thing put just enough of a smile on Powder's face to stop worrying, at least for now. "Whoa, Echo, come here, you gotta see this," Peter said, Echo walking beside him. While all of his friends might have been nerdy, Peter knew that none of them would get as excited about the nitty-gritty as Echo. The two of them were just about the only tinkerers, as Peter called them, of the crew. People who enjoyed not just the flashy aspects of science, but the nitty-gritty of it too. Not that he wasn't looking at something flashy. "Good eye," the tour guide said to the two boys as they stared at the pulsating energy ensnared in what appeared to be a glass tube. The screens of either side of it were running calculations that looked like gibberish to the average eye. "We had bets going around the office to see if anyone was going to stop in front of this little beauty, since it isn't exactly the most eye-catching," the tour guide responded. "You two must be something." Peter and Echo smiled at each other as she continued. "It's based on the technology used in the launch today. Rudimentary interdimensional travel, meant to be a bit more precise. While Dr. Richard's crew is focused on showing that interdimensional travel is safe for humans, this technology could be used to map extra-dimensional space if... Are you okay?" The guide asked Peter, whose face was frozen, sweat pooling down in buckets at a time. "Pete?" Peter heard Powder's voice echo in his ears, fading away into blackness as a much more prominent feeling hit him. Pain radiating up his arm, more intense than anything he'd ever felt, like his veins were being replaced by hot white fire. After what felt like an eternity to Peter, but in reality was maybe just a few moments, he looked down to see the cause of this feeling. A spider. One about the size of his hand that had sunk its pincers directly into him. Directly into the vein from the look of things. Powder stared at the thing at Peter's hand, her mind shooting back to the events of last night, to the creatures that she had let loose in the building when she was trying to make her escape. No. She rushed to Peter's side as the spider hopped off of him, crawling into the crowd of now panicking students, their screams melding with and drowning out the sound of Peter's gasp for air. Peter began thrashing around, his limbs flailing almost independently of his body, like they were wild animals lashed to a three-post. Any attempts that his friends tried to get him to be still were next to worthless, and then the situation somehow got even worse. One of Peter's limbs hit the machine next to him, and suddenly it didn't appear incredibly well built. The side of it collapsed almost immediately, the glass holding the source of light inside of it cracking as a bolt of blue energy shot out, the same blue energy that Powder had seen just last night, striking Echo in the chest as he too fell over, twitching alongside Peter. Powder just stared, her arms hanging by her sides as the world around her kept moving, as though time itself was pushing her by, leaving her in this moment, trapped, letting her feel the full weight of everything that just happened, everything that she allowed to happen. The hospital was quiet. Powder sat by May Parker in silence for the most part, exchanging a few words here or there with her when she was in Peter's room, which was only half of her waking hours. The other half of her time was spent with Echo, who was also unconscious. She was alone now. May was going to the mess hall to eat, a short break that she offered Powder. Powder declined. It had been a full day, and neither Peter nor Echo had woken up or even stirred. Heck, they barely moved. She grabbed her head, rubbing her temples as her brain began pounding against her skull. She felt her eyelids pull down against her will, getting heavier with each passing second. She hadn't slept in a while, so she supposed she could rest her eyes for a moment. Just a second. You might as well. Not like I'm getting up anytime soon. Powder's eyes shot open at Peter's voice, but when she stared at the bed, he was still unconscious, unmoving. Were you expecting anything different? The direction of the voice wasn't in front of her, it was next to her. She turned her head, now facing Peter, but not the one in the bed, a more disheveled looking one, gray to the eyes, like some kind of zombies. His veins ran a deep black. I know. It's like she just expects her mistakes to go away. Life doesn't work like that, pal. Echo's voice rang into her other ear. She turned to face it. Black soot stung his skin. Bits of flesh singed off. She hadn't seen what he looked like under the bandages that the hospital had put on, but they said his burns were minor. Yeah, minor. And strange energy never has any side effects. Echo's voice continued, carrying on the conversation like he could just read Powder's mind. This can't be happening. This isn't happening. Peter's in the bed. He's in the... Sure. Keep denying it. Both boys said at the same time. Powder's blood ran cold as she rushed to Peter's bedside, placing a hand to his skin. It was cold, like ice. Like he was dead. You couldn't follow a simple job, Echo scoffed. Of course she couldn't, Peter responded. We always had to watch her back. Don't know what made her think that she was suddenly a big shot. Should've just stayed back like they wanted you to, Echo replied. What a jinx, Peter said back. Powder felt her heart thump in her chest over and over, to the point that it felt like her ribs were cracking against the weight. It's all my fault, Powder muttered, feeling her body shaking increase even more. She closed her eyes tighter. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Powder! Vi's voice cut through the fog in Powder's mind. When she opened them, she found herself leaning against the wall, staring up at her sisters, their worried eyes looking back at her. What? Powder gurgled. Felicia let out a sigh of relief. Powder stared at her eyes. It was then that she realized there wasn't a hint of the disdain that was left yesterday. The frustration was gone. You were having one heck of a nightmare, Felicia continued. I'm sorry, Pow. She brushed the girl's hair with her hand. Powder gently grabbed Felicia's own hand with her own. No, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. Powder began muttering. Hey, it's okay, Felicia said, kneeling beside her. Everything's cool. She glanced over to Vi, who had a smile on her face, a rather confident one. Yeah, sure is, in more ways than one, Vi said, helping Powder to her feet, helping her around the curtain that draped over half the room to see. Peter sat up in his hospital bed, devouring from the looks of the empty containers around him his fourth cup of hospital jello. Next to him, propping himself up by crutches that it looked like he barely needed, Echo. Beside the two of them, Echo's adopted father, Otto Octavius, stood, giving Echo support with his hands that the boy clearly didn't need, but much appreciated. May Parker and Ben Parker were clutching Peter's hand while he ate. It looked like both parental figures were trying to ensure that their kids didn't float away. You guys... Oh, hey, Powder. Peter smiled, Echo turning to her and doing the same. Only his smile tried to be a bit more reassuring, since he could follow the girl's likely thought pattern. Powder said nothing at first, letting the silence hang between them, as her eyes continued to bore holes into the sight, refusing to even blink in case she found herself waking up again. Hey, we're fine, honest, Echo replied. Powder felt an elbow nudge her forwards, from which one of her sisters she didn't know. What she did know in that moment was that it didn't matter. It was all the encouragement she needed. She wrapped her arms around the two boys with enough force to pry them away from their parental figures. Hey, it's alright. We're alright, Peter said. Powder said nothing, allowing the moment to sink in. Allowing herself to know that in this moment, here and now, that things were okay. That things were going to be fine. Harry Osborn got up from his examination table. This was probably the third examination in the last few days that he'd gotten. His father was nothing if not thorough, and that little stint he had just gone through made the man very thorough. Mere seconds of exposure to that energy that was around the room was enough for Echo to pass out after all. The doctors in the room didn't speak much to him directly, so he'd have to wait for his father to interpret whatever results they came up with. Thankfully, the wait wasn't long. His father's warm smile let the boy breathe out a sigh of relief. You're gonna be just fine, Harry. It looks like the same is true of your friends. Wait, you mean? They're awake. Perfectly fine. He squeezed the boy's shoulder, seeing the tension leave his body with a heavy sigh. Harry was the one who asked his dad if a field trip like this was feasible after all. He didn't know if he'd forgive himself if... Harry shook the thought off. Now, I'm gonna go make a call to the hospital. Neither of those families should have to suffer the bills that could come with their little stay, Norman said. Wait, you're paying for them? Harry asked. Of course I am. Norman nodded to the boy. They were affected on my property. They're my responsibility. Norman smiled at his boy as he smiled back, as he got up from the personal hospital suite in Oscorp Towers, disappearing down a nearby hall until he came to a dimly lit space. The barely lit electronic thrum of computer monitors bounced back at him. In his seclusion, he clicked a contact on his phone, pulling the device up to his ear. "Otto," he said into the device. He could hear the muffled apologies of the man, as well as the shuffling of his clothes as he moved away from the crowd. "I'm with my son right now, Mr. Osborne." "Yes, I imagine so. Your son who made a miraculous recovery after being hit with enough energy to fry an average building's power grid," Norman said, the lack of response giving him an opening to continue. "I believe you know why I'm calling, Otto. If you did what I asked, I'll wire some money to you. It will be considerably useful for your son's continued recovery." "I took the blood samples when he was asleep," Otto replied quietly. "And the Parker boy?" Norman asked. "I couldn't, sir. There was..." "It's fine, Otto. Spend the night with your son. Take the samples to Mr. Tallis tomorrow," Norman responded. "Oh, thank you, sir," Otto responded as the phone clicked dead. Norman stared at the monitors, at the security feeds that displayed the cloaked individuals who had snuck into his building, who had set this whole thing into motion. Only one of them was recognizable to him, the one in black, white hair spilling from her head, the so-called Black Cat. He didn't know whether to thank the little cretin for inviting such a potential scientific breakthrough into his life, or to strangle them for just about everything else. But before he could do either, one thing was for certain. He'd have to find them first. Staring up at the blank surface above him, Dr. Reed Richards squirmed, his body strange, unfeeling, unmoving, as he came back into consciousness. "Dr. Richards, can you hear me? Dr. Richards?" A static voice came over the intercom. "Hi, dear," Reed said, the silence on the other side of the intercom leaving him with nothing but his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, he didn't like that. "Sue? Ben, Johnny... Sue?" Reed muttered, feeling the strength coming back to his body for a moment. "Dr. Richards, please. Something happened during your mission. Something... Where is... Your team encountered a surge of energy that none of our projections accounted for." Didn't account for? That wasn't right. Reed always accounted for everything. It wasn't a brag from him to admit it. It was a fact. His shuttle should have been able to withstand anything. He even had Sue and Victor check over. "Victor," Reed said, pushing himself upwards, the strength in his body now back to fighting shape. He caught a glimpse of himself on a nearby polished surface. He looked normal enough for a supposedly catastrophic accident. "The energy interacted with your body in a way we can't understand. It did things that were..." Reed began to tune out the voice above him. He had to find the others to make sure that they were okay, that whatever Victor had done to their experiment, to his math, hadn't cost the people that he cared about anything. He looked toward the door, reaching towards it as he grabbed the handle, only to realize that he actually hadn't gotten up from his bed, and that handle was more than 30 feet away from where he sat. He stared down at his now extremely long and almost rubbery arm. "Unbelievable. Fantastic," the voice on the intercom said, his voice catching in his throat. "You guys really didn't have to come home with me," Peter said, walking into the threshold of his doorway, with Powder and Echo following him shortly behind. "Don't blame me. She's the one who won't let me go home yet," Echo joked. "Not until I can walk you back. From this point forward, you two nerds aren't leaving my sight." She narrowed her eyes. "Seriously, you sure you don't need anything before I go with Echo and Mr. Octavius?" "Again, Powder, no. Harry's coming by soon, and in the meantime, May and Ben will relieve you of your duties." Peter smiled. "Fine. I'll see you tomorrow, Pete," she replied, leading Echo out of his room, essentially by the hand. Peter chuckled to himself as the door shut. "Geez, Parker, friends who worry about you enough to stalk you home. How'd you get that lucky?" He smirked to himself as he walked to his closet to get change from the clothes that were probably still germed up from the hospital. If not from the hospital, at least from Oscorp's floor. He was practically swimming on that thing for a while. "Guess the old Parker luck gave me something after..." Peter's voice was cut off by the cracking sound of his wall, as the closet door broke off in its entirety, in his hand. In fact, the metal of the handle was splintering against his palm by the second, like it was caught in a vice rather than his fist. Peter squinted, his analytical brain racing to pick up a thought, something, anything to describe what had just happened. In the end, it only came out with a few words. "What the fuck?" You know you didn't have to ride with us, right? Echo said, looking out the window, seeing Powder's reflection, her eyes watching him. What's going on with you today? Going on with me? I'm not allowed to be worried about my friend? I've known you a lot longer than that, pal. He nudged her. There's worried, and then there's that look you gave us at the hospital. It was like you thought we were already... Stop, please, Powder said, locking eyes with the boy, with the strongest glare that she'd ever given him. Almost like it was a warning, like something bad was going to happen if he kept pressing that particular button. It's been an emotional day, Echo's adopted father's voice rang in the front seat. I think we should all just take a breath and... The car went over a bump, rocking up, and when it landed back down, Echo's eyes were filled with a strange blue light, and when it cleared, his father's thought was nowhere to be found. Stop, please, Powder said, locking eyes with the boy with the strongest glare that she had ever given him, and the exact same tone that she had just had, down to the last syllable. Echo furrowed his brow. Didn't you? It's been an emotional day. Echo's adopted father's voice rang once more in the front seat. I think we should all just take a breath and... The car went over a bump again, rocking up and down the exact same way, only this time when it landed, it was completely uneventful. Calm down, alright? Maybe let this one go for now? Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Sorry, Echo whispered, blinking hard. Things seemed normal enough. Probably all in his head. Hey all, thanks so much for checking out this brand new corner of the Earth OCU universe. It was a lot of fun to work on and it took me a while to write. So, as always, I really appreciate you guys being here for the start of this new thing. If you liked it, I'd appreciate you saying so by pressing that silly little button, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss my next video. Until next time, I've been your captain, and it's been a pleasure to take you on another tour of the strongest Earth in the multiverse. See you around!